All right, so Shirley Jackson are of all the short stories I think that we've read this semester, I feel maybe 75% confident that you guys have read this story before. But we are going to read it again because I don't want to say wonderful in that it's a great story in turn. It is a great short story, but the things that happen in it are not great. So, Shirley Jackson was born December 14th, 1919 in San Francisco, California. She graduated from Syracuse University in 1940, and while she was a student there, she met her future husband, Stanley Edgar Hyman, who was a noted literary critic at the time. She lived a very interesting life with her husband, and they raised a family in Vermont. She's kind of a reclusive by nature. Um, and kind of an interesting fact, she dropped out of college and was put in a mental institution, um, which I think is interesting. But anyways, she dies in 1956 of heart trouble. So she wasn't very old at the time of her death. So um, during her lifetime, though, she was an American short story writer and novelist. And in addition to her novels and short stories, she also wrote a children's novel, Nine Magic Wishes, which I didn't know until I started doing a little bit of research on. She did um, most of her work was done by writing and giving writing seminars and things like that. But anyways, her style as an author can best be uh, defined as macabre. They are her works are full of dark undertones, with an impending sense of doom, and often framed by very ordinary settings and characters. Her most famous work, by and large, is the short story that we are reading for this week, The Lottery. Um, and The Lottery was first published in 1948 in the New Yorker magazine, and it was reported to have generated more negative letters from readers than any other story previously published by the magazine. Many canceled their subscription to the magazine after reading the story because they were so offended by the work and its suggestion that evil could be so easily and commonly carried out. Um, you'll see why as you read the story if you haven't already. Um, she herself, Shirley Jackson, received over 300 letters that summer alone. She said, quote, I can count only 13 that spoke kindly to me. Even my own mother scolded me. Um, Dad and I did not care at all for your story. It does seem, dear, that this gloomy kind of story is what all you young people think about these days. Why don't you write something to cheer people up? And generally, she really refused to explain the meaning of her story, but she did once tell a journalist, I suppose I hoped by setting a particular brutal right in the present and in my own village to shock the readers graphic with a graphic demonstration of pointless violence and general inhumanity of their own lives. But I gather that in some cases the mind just rebels. The number of people who expected Mrs. Hutchinson to win a Bendix washer at the end would amaze you. So I think that tells us a lot about um, kind of where um, Shirley Jackson is with writing this story. It is kind of this horrible story about the dangers of mindless traditions and groupthink and things like that. And part of that has to do with its cultural context. The first kind of cultural context that I think that it's important to kind of go through is to look at this kind of idea of ritualistic sacrifice that comes from ancient cultures, particularly in Athens, Greece, where they believed that human sacrifice promised fertile crops. Um, and a similar thing happens um, in our story by giving by the transference of sins to a person or animal. It's an elimination of sins. So basically, some kind of background is that these during these annual festivals, citizens would stone to death a man or a woman selected for the purpose, and it explains kind of this idea of that person being a Christ-like figure or a scapegoat, where a person or group takes responsibility for the perceived faults of society. So keep that in mind as we read through the story. Another kind of historical context that I want to kind of cover is that this story was written in 1948, which is post World War II. And after World War II, Americans tended to imitate those around them rather than follow their own separate paths. Encouraging this conformity was the spread of television, which broadcast the same set of images to Americans scattered throughout the country. So we get this idea of conformity and unity through this kind of conformity during this time. Adding to that idea of conformity, we also had this. You got to remember that this was written during the Cold War. And politically speaking, people feared the spread of communism, leading to un American activities. And a lot of that has to do with issues about they feared fascist and dictatorships and communism that had been heightened and revealed during the previous war. And we get this induced paranoia and suspicion among people in American communities. We have things like the Red Scare with Joseph McCarthy. People there were committees formed with that looked to spy on their neighbors to see who was a communist. They created a Hollywood blacklist, and essentially it kind of turned into a witch hunt. And if you've read The Crucible, you'll kind of remember these kind of concepts. But for all intents and purposes, people were afraid, or are afraid of people who think and do differently than the rest. And so this idea of dissent from the common kind of belief was discouraged. And I don't think that that's a far cry from where we are today. But also, adding to the historical context, in 1943, news of Nazi concentration camps finally reached America, and a number of Americans responded with horror and concern that communities could have stood by and silently allowed the Holocaust and these kind of terrible things to occur, to these inhumane things to occur to people. But I think with this story we have or what Jackson is kind of hinting around is that at any given time, um, we're all guilty of that same kind of thing. The American townspeople are unable to question or prevent the brutal lottery practice in our story from taking place, and they willingly practice and participate in that tradition. Um, I do want you guys to pay attention to our setting. Um, some critics have said that it takes place in New England, where Shirley Jackson lives. But and I think it's interesting because here we have a kind of modern day witch hunt, not unlike someone like Nathaniel Hawthorne, who also kind of alludes to um, those Puritan beliefs. But anyways, that would be an interesting paper for someone to write. But No Name USA, anytime, this universal setting, it can happen anywhere. And the lottery or social practices that we follow blindly, even though they're outdated or misunderstood or no longer have the same kind of meaning that they once did, kind of alludes to this idea that we have social problems in our society that we actively ignore, and all communities are guilty of this. So another way of saying, don't throw stones at glass houses, kind of thing. The other thing that I do want to mention also is this idea of allegory. And we've read allegories before with Washington Irving, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, where characters represent ideas and intangible concepts. So we have those types of characters in our story, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about that. Pay attention. I guess my final thoughts of things to pay attention to in this story are biblical allusions and the symbolism, not only of colors or items, but also people's names. And I also think it's interesting to note that a lot of people have said that this story is kind of like a modern day parable, where we're supposed to learn. And remember when we were reading parables and talking about them, parables are there to teach a moral lesson. So this could be seen as a parable, and I'm interested to see what you guys think that Shirley Jackson, what lesson she's trying to impart upon us. So that's it for me for now, on these two stories. So I'm excited to come together with you guys this week and talk about these stories. They seemingly have very little in common, but I think that once we talk about things and come together, they have more in common than they initially appear. So let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys later on this week.